Hey you guys, welcome back to the channel. Today's video is going to be one that's requested. I have a few students that's been wanting me to show a video on how to put this garment together. We did have a quick class on how to do it, but I think we ended up running out of time and having to cut the class short. So this focus will just be for the ones that needed a little bit of extra guidance on how to put the garment together. I like to use a rotary blade when I'm cutting the material only because it's super quick. I can just run through it. If you have a rotary blade, the thing that you have to have in conjunction with it is a cutting mat. You cannot cut on a regular table. You will dull your blade, you'll damage your table, and pretty much everything else. So just be sure to have your mat laid out in order for you to use that rotary blade. Now, I did extend this pattern a few more inches, which is something that some of the students did because the people that they were making the garments for, their spouses, they wanted the shirts to be super long. So I did extend it. If you are going to extend it, follow the same process as I am doing now. If not, you can just go ahead and trim off the garment at the actual hem. So just like we did with the center back, we'll do the same with the center front. The only difference with the center front is that there is a placement for your placket. So be sure to trim out that small little area for the placket so that you are able to place it. Take your time and use your scissors, whatever you need to, in order to cut that accurately. If you had extended your center back pattern, then you'll have to do the same for the front. You can match up that side seam since that's where it will be connecting, and then from there you have your actual length of how long the front should be. Be sure to add all of your markings before you move your pattern. Once you have all of your patterns cut out, your sleeve, your back, your front, your neckline interfacing, your placket and collar cut out, you have to make sure that you cut out your interfacing in order to fuse it. When you're fusing, iron it down. Be sure to use like an iron cloth just to keep it nice and stable. Your placket, you can go ahead and fold it over onto the seam allowance just so that you can have your creases already in place. And from this point, we would be ready to sew. The very first thing we'll be sewing is the shoulder. So if your fabric has a right and wrong side, be sure to put the right sides together so that you can sew onto the wrong side of the fabric. I kept my seam allowance at 1/2 inch. So be sure to follow the instructions because I believe it was 5/8. Once sewn, it should look a little something like this. Now you have an option to zigzag stitch the raw edge of the shoulder, or you can go ahead and serge it if you have a serger. You can serge it closed, or you can zigzag stitch it open or closed. It's up to you. Just remember, whatever you do on the left side, again, you must do to the right. Now that your shoulders are complete, the next thing to do would be to attach the collar. Now, your collar has to be already fused with the interfacing before you start sewing it. So on the outer edge, you're going to put, again, right sides together. On the outer edge, you are going to sew like a C shape. Be sure you're sewing the outer upper edge and not the portion that is supposed to be attaching to your actual neckline. Once it's sewn, you can go ahead and set it aside and grab your neckline interfacing. Attaching them at the shoulder seam, go ahead and sew it with the regular seam allowance that we did for the garment, which was 1/2 inch. Go ahead and grab your collar so that we can attach it. Before we attach it to the body of the garment, we are going to trim. Trim around the corner of where you sewed. Make sure to not clip your actual stitch line. The reason to why we are trimming it is so that when you turn it inside out, it's nice and flat. Use something that is not too sharp so that you don't make a hole in it. I know here I'm using my scissors, but it's because I'm used to doing that, and it's really quick and simple. If you can definitely use your scissors, just be gentle so that you don't poke a hole through it. Now that you have your collar turned inside out and you've already ironed it, it's laying nice and flat. With the marking that you had put on the center back of the collar, go ahead and line it up to the neckline for the center back of the body of your garment. Make sure that you are putting it on the right side, so right side to right side, of course, and then add your pins all the way around. You should have had some markings for where your seam allowance for the shoulder line was supposed to be. Be sure to line it up there too. And then you're gonna pin it all the way around. You should have a 1/2 inch to 5/8 of an inch of seam allowance hanging in the front so that we can attach our placket. Pin it, secure it, do everything that you need to do so that it stays in place. Now that you've sewn down your collar to the neckline of the garment, you're going to do the same for the interfacing, the neckline interfacing. Go ahead and grab it just like we did with the collar. We're going to attach it at the center back first. So grab some pins, attach it at your center back marking, and then you're going to attach it at your shoulder seam. Be sure to keep your shoulder seam open on the neckline interfacing. Again, just like before, it's going to be right side to right side, so we are sewing on the wrong side. The only thing that's different with the collar and the neckline interfacing is that your interfacing will go all the way towards the center front. Remember, the collar is not going to get sandwiched into the placket, so it's stopped a 1/2 inch away from the center front. But your neckline interfacing will go all the way towards the edge of the center front. So it should match exactly at the center front. Once you have it all pinned in, go ahead and sew it all the way across, just like you did with the collar. Alright, you guys, so the hardest part is pretty much over. It's easy peasy lemon squeezy from here. You're going to grab your placket and line it up with the center front. So the side edge of your placket should be lining up to your center front. Make sure to leave about a 1/2 inch of seam allowance right above the top, only because the top of the neckline where we folded the interfacing with the front, with the center front, is tucked in. So now it has no seam allowance and is technically a clean edge. So we're going to have to do the same with the placket. So leave about a 1/2 inch right at the top and just continue pinning along the downside edge of your center front all the way down to the bottom of the opening. Once you secure one side, we have to do the same for the other side. So it's up to you if you want to pin both now or if you want to just do one at a time. At times it is easier to do both at the same time, just in case, just so that you can see where you need to stop. But you can go ahead and just grab a marker and just mark your stopping point. That way it matches on both sides anyway. Once your seam line is done for the center front, go ahead and flip your garment upside down. That way you have a better viewpoint of where you need to make your diagonal lines. These diagonal lines are put in place just so that when you are turning your placket inward, it lays nice and flat. So from your opening, you're going to make a diagonal cut to where your stitch line stopped. Be sure to not cut your stitch line, otherwise you will have a hole in your center front. And make sure that your stitch line is not going under or over where it needs to be. So stop exactly where your stitch line ends. Now that we've created those diagonal cuts, we are able to tuck in our placket and we can actually turn it inside out. But before we do that, we have to close the neckline first. So flip your garment over so that you are working at the top. And what you're going to do is fold your placket right side to right side. Be sure that those seam allowances are folded. And you can go ahead and sew straight across. That seam allowance is going to be a half, just like before. And we're also going to trim. We are trimming just so that it could stay nice and flat and clean. Once you have that trimmed and once you are done turning it inside out, you can grab your iron and your ironing board to lay it flat. The same thing we did to the left side is the same thing that we're gonna do to the right. Always try to have your ironing board and your iron readily available, because as you sew, it's really important that you lay the seams down flat. It'll help you in the end. It may take a few minutes in the process that you are taking to iron, but in the long run, it'll save you time. Now that the neckline is complete, the next thing to do would be to close out the side of the placket before we close the bottom. So if everything has already been ironed, it will definitely help you with this process. With your sewing machine, you can edge stitch straight along the side of the garment. So just do an edge stitch, keep it very close. You'll have to untuck the bottom of your placket so that you don't sew on the actual body. So untuck it, fold your material over, that way you sew right on the edge. And just like we do with the left side, we'll do the same for the right side. Now that your placket is done, go ahead and grab a couple pins and pin them together. That way they are nice and secure and they're stable and centered. Once they're centered, flip your garment over, or you could flip the bottom up. That way you're able to see the bottom edge, and you are going to sew right across that little triangular part that we had created, just so that we can stabilize it. From here, we are simply going to attach the sleeve. Use your pins. You could start from your underarm. Go ahead and pin at the markings that we had placed. Be sure to keep your seam allowance the same for the shoulder seam. That way, if it's sewn open at the shoulder seam where the neckline is, make sure that you're following that same process for the opening of the sleeve. Add as many pins as needed so that you can secure it in place, and then go ahead and sew it at a half an inch seam allowance. How I normally sew my sleeves, I'll have the body of the actual garment at the top, so that it's being pulled by the presser foot, and then the sleeve is at the bottom. So during the first notch, it'll just be like a regular stitch, but as I get to my actual notch and I'm about to pass it to go to the actual sleeve cap, I'll put my hand in between and I'll gather up the material of the sleeve, and as I sew, I'll slightly tug on the body of the garment, allowing more of the sleeve to slide through and being pulled by the feed dogs, right? As you get to a certain point, and as you get closer to the sleeve cap, you can remove your pins as you go, but then you're going to do the same process again for the other side of that sleeve cap. Gather up the material, hold the body of the garment at the top slightly, and just slowly allow it to pull the material on its own. As you do that, it will allow you to have a nice even sleeve without having any gathers. So it pulls in the sleeve, it pulls in the ease without having gathers. As you get to your first notch that's towards the end of the sleeve, just go ahead and sew it regularly until you reach the underarm. Do that for both sides. Once you're done, you're going to go ahead and zigzag stitch the seam allowance, or you're going to serge. Now that the sleeve is attached, the next thing would be to sew your side seam. From the last notch that is on that side of your garment, go ahead and sew it all the way down to the hem of your sleeve. Just like we've been doing, you have to make sure that you zigzag stitch that raw edge, or you're going to serge it. Make sure to do it open so that you can finish your hem. It is going to be a split, a side split, so if it's serged closed or zigzagged closed, then when you get to the opening you'll have an issue. So be sure to zigzag stitch it open. Repeat the same process for the other side. Once you're done, you can hem your sleeve by rolling it twice and top stitching right on top. Alright, so sleeves are done. The last thing to do would be the split and the hem of the garment. Go ahead and grab your iron. I know you guys are getting tired of it, but go ahead and grab it. You're going to iron your side seam open. Iron it open so that it'll stay nice and flat. This cotton fabric that I have, oh my goodness, it is so stubborn. But when you spray it down with some starch and you iron it, it really looks really nice. Don't judge my zigzag stitching. I did not use a serger for it, therefore it looks kind of ugly. Nobody's going to be wearing this garment. It's just something that I made for you guys so that you guys can take a look at it. But now that your ironing is done, go ahead and hem the bottom of the garment. So just like you did with your sleeve, you're going to fold it over twice. Now, if you are bad with measuring and you're not able to eyeball it, definitely use your tape measure or a ruler so that you can have that proper amount rolled over. That way, you know, everything is nice and even and it's not going from 1/4 of an inch to an entire inch. Okay, measure it. I'm able to eyeball it, which is why normally I just go ahead and I tackle it without, you know, having to pin it down or iron it. Unless it's something like a super long hem, then don't nobody got time for that. I'll iron it down. But instead of winging it every time, it can be a mess. But just take your time. You know, if you're making this for someone, do it the right way. Measure it. Make sure that everything's coming out right. Just take the few seconds that you need to ensure that the measurement and the amount that you're rolling over is accurate. Your hem is complete, you can go ahead and line up the edge of the material. You are going to be top stitching, so if you start at the hem, be sure to back stitch. You're going to sew all the way up. Your seam allowance, try to keep it at 1/2 inch. When you get up to where the side seam actually joins, you're going to go past the opening. I would say probably 2 to 3 stitches, or if not 1/4 of an inch. Sink your needle, lift up your presser foot, pivot and turn. Go across that seam. Make sure that the distancing is the same as it is on the other side. Sink your needle again, pivot and turn, and then of course put down your presser foot and you'll sew all the way back down to the hem. When you get down to the hem, be sure to back stitch. And you are done, my dear. This is what it looks like. If you guys have any questions, definitely just drop them down below. You have my number, just reach out to me. I'll be more than happy to answer. This garment is not for anyone specific. It's just something that I put together just so that you guys would be able to have a view and a better understanding, just in case you had questions on things that were missed during the class. Subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions, drop them down below. And happy sewing. I'll see you next time.